You're listening to Bring Me the Axe. I'm Brian White. I'm one half of this morbid equation, and I'm joined by my co-host and brother, Dave White. Hey, Dave, how you doing?
Thank you for asking. I'm doing okay, but I'll tell you what, I'm feeling a little bad because I cannot help but find enjoyment in these eating the pets memes and video remixes that are going around. And I know that it's not, the source material is pretty heinous, but God damned if these aren't the funniest things I've ever seen.
There's one I saw we put the spring in Springfield that just knocked me over.
Yeah,
I laugh at it every time.
It is classic stuff.
It's good stuff. Just top shelf comedy.
Yeah, I like when people take their talents and their creativity and they just put it towards the dumbest shit, and it is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, I had quite an adventure this afternoon. Today, I spent my afternoon up at Haunted Overload, which, if you're listening to this, you've never heard of it. It's like it's one of the sort of top haunt attractions in the country. It's sort of a haunt worth traveling for. They're building a 50-foot structure in the likeness of their logo, which is like this giant jack-o'-lantern. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's like basically getting to hang out at one of those haunted amusement parks that's in every episode of Scooby-Doo. Mm-hmm. It's just the coolest shit.
Are there any? What was the robot? The robot was the Joyland one, and there was a clown.
Yes. No haunted robots. No robot ghosts.
Okay. Well, and what state is this? What is this?
This is in the state of New Hampshire, in scenic
Heard of it.
Lee, New Hampshire. But yeah, it's pretty amazing. If you've been following us on Instagram, I've been posting a lot of stories related to it. The structures, the stuff that they've built there is just unbelievable, and it's just like a couple of people. It's truly a sight to behold.
And if anybody's wondering, well, should I go to New Hampshire? No, you shouldn't.
Oh, no, you should go to New Hampshire for this, because this is amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, so we practically grew up in neighborhood video stores, and the steady diet of utter garbage that those shops provided us with continues unabated to this day. And there's no one else I enjoy chopping it up with more about trashy movies than Dave. Just before we get into it, it's a little housekeeping. If you want to keep up with us between episodes, you can also find us on Instagram at Bring Me the Axe Pod, and Dave's over there at That Queerwolf. Mm-hmm. Follow us. We're fun. We have a good time. Yeah. I'm also on TikTok doing the dances.
Yep.
You know?
Doing the Harlem Shuffle.
Yeah. Doing the Bernie.
Doing the Super Bowl Shuffle.
Yeah.
Look, I only know 6 dances, and they're all from the 70s or the 80s. Okay, so.
Yeah. Look us up by name over there. And if you don't know, we have another show called 99-Cent Rental, where we cover all manner of video store madness on the weeks of Bring Me the Axes Off. Our latest episode covering Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is out now. And we'll be back next week with a look at Toho's batshit fantasy house. Yes. It's going to be... we haven't even recorded it, and I guarantee you it's going to be nuts. Mm-hmm. There's also a Bring Me the Axe bonus episode out now for Friday the 13th, looking at part 2 in that storied history. So, get on it. You can also contact us directly at bringmetheaxepod@gmail.com with any questions, comments, or suggestions. Do let us know if there's a movie that you love and would like to hear us give it the business. And lastly, if you like what you hear, you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube now. Search for us by name and subscribe if you prefer to consume your podcasts that way. And you'll be doing us a favor by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So I don't know what you're waiting for.
Yes, do.
Do it. Just get to it. It's easy.
Do that.
Yep. And if you listen on YouTube, do us a favor and give the episode a like and leave a comment. We love hearing from you guys. Just want to get all that out of the way right at the top of the show because, hey, Dave.
Yeah.
Who's this over here?
Well, we have a guest, but not just any guest. He is a writer, producer, director, co-host of the Midnight Mass podcast, and a lover of Draculas, both old and new. It's Michael Varrati.
Hi, Michael.
Hello. I am super thrilled to be here. Thank you both for having me.
We've been looking forward to this one for quite some time. Also, I love that Draculas are used as just a noun these days.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I'm into
that. Yeah. So, I was doing my notes, and I put Dracula with a lowercase d, and I didn't even try to correct me. Yep. So right now is where we would usually run the trailer for the movie that we're about to watch, but as it would happen, there isn't one. I mean, I suppose I could run the trailer for 1931 Tod Browning Dracula, but
That seems unfair.
yeah. But yeah,
Because the whole reason that I chose this film is that it is, I believe, as of today, it is Latin American Heritage Month. And I am someone who loves Latin American horror films. I specifically love Mexican horror films. And this is sort of the, I think, perhaps the Mexican horror film. Maybe not. Maybe this is a little bit more American.
Yeah. Last year, for the same occasion, we covered Ruben Galindo's "Don't Panic," one hell of a movie.
Also a classic.
As
far as I'm concerned.
Maybe the Mexican horror movie. But
Yep.
no, this one right here, this one is a special one. It is the 1931 Dracula, the Spanish language version.
Conde Dracula.
El Conde Dracula.
Oh.
And it's quite a movie. I
Yeah.
Until we'd done this, I'd never seen it. It's one of those movies I'd always intended to see and I just never got around to. I think in order to watch it, you kind of have to buy a sort of like box set of.
It is in the box set.
Of like the Universals, or maybe it's just a Dracula box set.
It's in both, because the Universal Monsters box set is just a collection of the individual Universal Monsters, individual monster collection. So they just slap them all together, and it's in the Dracula one. Michael, have you seen it?
It is funny, though, because you have to get at least some Universal release of the Bela Lugosi Tod Browning Dracula, and it's always included kind of as a special feature, but it's a much longer feature than the actual feature it's accompanying, which makes it kind of interesting.
It runs like 30 minutes longer than the Browning version, which is
and
really interesting, because honestly, it doesn't feel like it.
No, and like I said to you, that's 30 minutes of just people staring at each other mostly.
Yep. Once again, my impression. This is a visual thing, so listener, I'm sorry you don't get to see this, but here's my impression of Conde Dracula.
Yeah,
not bad, right? Not bad.
It's pretty spot on.
I'll put it on Instagram. Give you a reason to follow us over there. Michael, have you ever seen this one?
I haven't. Actually, this is one of those that I, like you, knew about for many years because of its history. The idea that it was shot on the same sets as Tod Browning's Dracula in the evening times while the cast of the English language version was sleeping for the night. It was something that was always a curiosity, but I had never gotten around to seeing, and I was glad when you reached out and asked about it, because I do love Dracula, and I love the farther reaches of Dracula's place in pop culture, but this is one of those that, even though I own the Blu-ray from Universal, just had not had occasion to sit down and watch, and this really gave me a cause. Not that you ever need a cause to watch a Dracula movie, but it gave me a cause, and I'm so glad that I finally did, because I immediately had so many thoughts, and I think it's a really gorgeous film, and I know we're going to get into it. But there is this very interesting history of Dracula as Dracula exists in foreign language markets. Yep. And this is sort of a very early, obviously entry in that. But even before cinema, we know that the book was traveling the world, and when different authors were hired to translate Stoker's work in different countries, there were sort of embellishments made, like the Icelandic version.
I was going to bring it up. Powers of Darkness is a hell of a book, though I do find it kind of fascinating that it's mostly the first half of the book of Stoker's novel, and then like the last 20 pages just yada yadas the entire Whitby segment, which is just crazy. But that book is nuts, and it goes in weird directions.
It's a huge deviation, but it became sort of its own entry in Dracula lore because of the difference. And it's not the only country that happened in. In Turkey, there is a version of the novel that is still epistolary, and it follows a lot of the beats, but of course Turkish culture and Western Christian culture were very different at the time the book was written, and still different. And so the Van Helsing character is a very different person, and the relationships are all very different, and that's an interesting entry. So to have this take that was made for Spanish language market with sort of a cross-section of people from Spanish-speaking countries is really interesting. And I found this quote from the son of the woman who plays Ava. And I need to look it up because he basically talks about how the movie was in many ways an example of the immigrant experience, both in the delivery and the making of it, because of how they had to do things after hours. Here it is. He says, they had to come in at night and work crappy hours, and they had a lower budget, but they ended up making a better movie, he said, because that's a great American immigrant story and such a great Latino story, because oftentimes coming to this country, you have to work harder, you have less support, less opportunities, and you still have to deliver. And they over-deliver it, and is often the case. So it was just kind of a beautiful underdog immigrant story. And thinking about that, after having watched this movie, it makes me appreciate this movie even more.
And I would like to point out that his children are the two guys that made American Pie. That is true.
What?
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I had no
Lupita
idea.
Tovar's grandsons are the guys that made that. They made a bunch of other movies too. They're, I think, quite successful, but that is who they are.
That is funny as hell. Yeah, so shall we do some facts here?
Yes, let's.
All right, so the year was 1931. Year of our Lord. So here's some other movies that were released in the year of 1931. Dracula, obviously, was released in 1931. Frankenstein was also released in 31. A real 1-2 punch for 31. Big year. Because one of the things that I had seen, like, this was kind of an anemic year for horror movies. It was kind of after this that they become sort of a viable genre.
The Universal monsters are kind of what revitalized not just Universal, but like the horror genre, at least in terms of film, because it was the first time, probably first time in a long time, maybe, that adults were starting to take it seriously again as a genre. It was always considered a kid thing, and obviously it fluctuates past that. It still today is considered mostly not as serious. But this was really like when people were like, I guess maybe you can tell. You have to do it in a gothic fashion, but
they
you can make serious horror. Yeah.
But like usually when we rattle off these other movies, like I've got like 5, I could really only find 4 worth talking about, which really kind of says something about that particular year and the genre of horror. Because also the other 2 big ones, we had Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and rounding it out, M, which is a crazy good movie.
Yeah, it's also a German movie, so I don't even think it counts if it's not American.
Oh, you jerk.
Nah, it's a good movie.
So
it's a gross movie. It's a terrifying movie, but
yeah, it's a very, very intense movie. Very, very German. Our cast and crew, we've got a director named George Melford, who was a contemporary of Cecil B. DeMille. And he was also a big name back in the day, pretty much as big as DeMille. His greatest credit is directing Valentino in The Sheik.
Yeah,
which is, whenever they show Rudolph Valentino, that's the movie that they sort of convey that idea with. He directed over 100 movies, but the vast bulk of his work took place during the silent era, and many of them are considered lost.
He seems like a kind of just like a journeyman director at within the studio system.
Yes, like the fact that his name hasn't really endured in the same way that DeMille's has says quite a bit about him. But like he was a star of the studio at the time,
And I think everybody, at least in terms of this movie, speaks very, very highly of him. But he didn't speak any Spanish, so that they used an interpreter the whole time.
Nope. Which is a very odd choice.
Well, the weird thing is
that not unusual during the studio.
It certainly is like atypical. Like when I read that, I was like, I suppose that makes sense.
Well, I mean, just when you think about how they even constructed this, the idea that they felt strongly enough that they wanted foreign market money, but did not want to invest enough time to make a totally separate foreign film. Even though this is a separate film, it's like, well, you have to use the sets that we already have while we're shooting parallel. It's sort of like they undercut this in every way possible as an afterthought in some ways. And even so, they cared enough to make it, but not enough to maybe hire a director who speaks the language of the actors to the market that you are trying to appeal to, which goes back to the quote from The Sun that kind of speaks about how they were given all of these obstacles. And so the fact that he turned out a beautiful looking movie while not really having a means to communicate with the cast who star in it is kind of impressive.
Yeah. When we get around to it, like towards the end, I'm sure we'll discuss the sort of inevitable, is this the better movie? Because for years, many people have sort of made that claim. I'm on the fence, but it'll be an interesting discussion.
Well, I think this has an interesting history. This was obviously, not obviously, but this was a common practice that they used to do. International releases in this fashion. They would just sort of remake the same movie because 50% of Universal's revenue was coming from international markets.
Yep.
And that revenue stream gave them enough power that they could say, we want you to do this. We need you to do it this way. And Universal kind of had to capitulate to a point. I mean, they were still the ones in charge. But I think it's interesting. This one in particular is headed up by 3 Americans. And none of them spoke Spanish.
Right.
And so it feels a little like, here's a Spanish version, but it's still kind of American. Because it's really being given to you by these people who are coming from an American sensibility. Like this is their sort of worldview and their approach to filmmaking. But it also sounds like the guy, Kohner, I can't remember his first name,
Paul
the producer.
Kohner.
Yeah. So he was really close with Carl Laemmle, the senior.
Yep.
And he started his career like as an office boy and sort of worked his way up, and he became Laemmle's assistant by the end. And I guess their relationship had become so close that he kind of thought of him as like a son, which for Carl Laemmle Jr. was a little bit offensive, is my guess. And he, I guess, sort of had like a kind of rivalry. So when it came time to do this, because this is towards the end of this run of international films that they're doing, they're doing these simultaneous productions. And he didn't go out of his way to sort of sync their production, but he did not give them the sort of leeway and the resources that they had given to other movies, largely because he didn't like Kohner.
Yeah, which is interesting because, like, you would think I suppose it's just the nature of like family dynamics, but the Browning production of Dracula was a shit show.
Oh yeah, it was a fucking nightmare.
And
mostly because of Carl Front, though.
Okay, but like you would think that he would just be like, "Oh, listen, do whatever you want. I'm a little busy over here."
I think he also felt like, because horror was Carl Jr.'s, that was sort of his thing.
Right.
He's the one who encouraged them to do this. And so I think he saw this other guy who was young, and he's a little bit younger maybe than he was, than Carl Jr. And I think he kind of saw him as like weird competition and was like, yeah, screw this guy. Like I'm not gonna fuck with him to the extent that it's going to undercut our profit. But I'm going to fuck with him enough that I'm going to make this difficult and sort of try to run him out, because he actually did end up running him out like a couple years later, because he didn't have a contract with Universal, even though he'd been there since he was like 15.
Yeah.
So he ends
this
up
movie
getting the
falls
boot.
late in his career as a director. He retires from directing in the 40s, a very wealthy man working in Hollywood at a critical moment. Spends the rest of his life appearing here and there in small roles and features. So yeah, this movie in 1931 is like one of his final features, which is really crazy to think of.
Well, and I think this movie also led to sort of a fundamental shift in approach to foreign markets, because even though it did well in some places, it didn't have the rate of return that I think they had expected. And they realized that they could make just as much money by just overdubbing. Yeah. And that became the common practice.
Yeah, that was ultimately the challenge. So the reason that they made a Spanish language version, like a co-production of this, was because they had just come out of the silent era. Sound talkies, they're becoming like a viable sort of, it's in demand. People want movies with sound. With silence, it was very simple. If you wanted to sell your movie overseas, your interstitial and your title cards just had to be translated, and you just output a version of that for France and Spain and Italy.
Yeah, it's the singing in the rain thing. It's like once they have to talk, it's a whole new system.
Yeah, and so the technology for overdubbing isn't quite there yet. And so they're like, what Fox ends up doing is like they just start doing this, where like they just reuse the sets on the off hours, and there's like another like foreign language production going on at the same time. And so Paul Kohner brought this to Carl Laemmle and was like, we should do this. And Laemmle was like, yeah, I guess so. And I suppose it worked for a little while, but yeah, by now it just didn't pull in the money that I think they were expecting it to. And it only took a couple of years for dubbing to become like a viable technology, and subtitles came along not long after that. So yeah, it's an unwieldy way to go about making a foreign language version of your English language movie.
And they're also running straight into the Depressions. Like, not too long after this, you're going to hit peak Depression era.
Yeah.
And they had to save money somewhere. And so it was kind of like, where can we cut the fat here? And this is probably it.
Especially with the movies so this is the early 30s. The movies that they were doing for like European non-English speakers kind of ran into a snag, because a lot of the production was happening in Germany, and then the Nazis happened. And so
so you can't just keep filming there, I guess, huh?
Right.
What, were they busy?
Right. Things kind of happen in Spain. Things kind of go poorly for Italy. Like, just the whole things really go poorly for France. So this just becomes like a very unwieldy. There's no getting around that. That World War II was really the final nail in this coffin.
Yeah, World War II, doing it again.
Just ruin it for everybody. So our cast includes Carlos Villarreal, and I'm not going to roll my R's. I'm just going to sound ridiculous doing that. He was born in Spain. He immigrated to the United States as World War I is breaking out in Europe. His fluency in English and experience on stage gave him a great advantage in a studio system that was adapting to talkies. And so by the time of his retirement in the 50s, Villarreal had over 80 movies to his name in just over 20 years.
Guy's got a huge smile, too. Gigantic. It's like 40% of his face is teeth.
I love it. You know what? His scenes in this movie remind me of all of the reenactments that they did in Renfield with Nicolas Cage, because they look a lot alike.
Yep.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was a reference point. And I do think that Nicolas Cage, being Nicolas Cage, probably has seen this
for
movie.
sure, yeah. But yeah, this guy's credits list is nuts. Like, I mean, he wasn't just working in Spanish language movies. Like, he did a lot of Westerns for the English market as well. Like, he was a very busy guy. I think I counted it up. In 1931 alone, he did 8 movies.
I mean, that's when movies took like 4 days to make. And they were all just on cocaine the whole time.
Front to back production is like 30 days.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this movie took them, 3 weeks to make?
Something like that.
Or 3 weeks of
I think it was 22 days
shooting.
30 minutes longer than Browning's version, and yet somehow they finished before Browning did, and it was like under budget as well.
Yeah, it was under budget by like $3,000, and it was a couple weeks early.
Jesus.
Like, it was to the point where they were having trouble because they were shooting certain scenes, and Browning's version hadn't gotten to that point, and so the set wasn't ready yet. And so they had to like come up with a workaround or just wait and shoot something else.
Yeah. We've also got Lupita Tovar, who's one of Mexico's first stars of the Golden Age. She signed with Fox early in her career as sound pictures were coming into fashion. And
she won a contest. That's how she became an actress. She won a contest.
Which is crazy.
This is why I love this era of Hollywood, where you can just like win a fucking contest and the next thing you know, you're like a star.
Yeah.
I mean, the ones that it actually worked out for, they actually did have talent. Like, it wasn't just that they looked great in a sweater. That might have gotten them there, but like, you had to deliver.
You got to be able to stay there.
Right.
And you also have to withstand a lot of sexual harassment.
Oh,
a lot.
Particularly in this poor woman's case, because she is central to the entire reason that Universal picks up the multi-language versions. And that is because producer Paul Kohner was like obsessed with her.
And hey, he won in the end. They're married. Well, they're dead now, but
yeah, so
they were married.
She was extremely useful to Fox for being bilingual and extremely talented at a time when studios were beginning to make these mirror image versions of movies in Spanish, French, and German. Following the release of Dracula, Tovar starred in a Spanish-language melodrama called Santa, which came to define the shape of her career, which was long and extremely fruitful. Lupita died in 2016 at the age of 106.
Yeah, that's clean Mexican living.
Wow. when I saw that, I was like, holy shit, really? Yeah. So rounding out our cast as a guy named Barry Norton, who was born in Argentina as Alfredo Carlos Biraben. He entered Hollywood and almost immediately found success in the silence. His good looks put him in league with Rudolph Valentino, and being fluent English speaker, he took the sound age naturally. But the studio system, being what it is, thought he was a great asset for their multiple language versions, and he sort of got stuck there.
He has a very square head.
It's a very square head and a disturbingly boyish face.
Yeah, it is a little bit creepy.
Yeah. While it made him quite wealthy, when his approach to filmmaking was done, the studio found no use for him, and his appearances in film were reduced to just background parts, which is just so fucking sad.
I imagine he was probably popular because he's very American looking. I think he's Argentinian.
He has American leading man look like, top to bottom.
Except, like, he looks like a 12-year-old. So he's kind of like, who was the bully on the Howdy Doody? He kind of looks like that.
J.D. Vance.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. We'll kind of track the sort of evolution of Dracula in film. So Dracula.
Well, there is one more person worth noting, and that is George Robinson, who was the DP on this.
Okay.
Because Robinson was he did a lot of the stuff that came after Dracula's Daughter. He did House of Dracula. Okay. He did a lot of the Abbott and Costello Meat movies. He did like a lot of sci-fi shit in the 50s, like Tarantula. But he was, I think, responsible for the aesthetic, which is a little bit different in this one. And I think it is also probably the reason why I think it is a little bit more successful, is that they use
this movie is extremely dynamic in the way that it is actually produced. The camera moves a lot because like Browning was very much like of the age. You know, it's like he was. You
set it and forget it.
It's like he would film. It's like they were filming a play. So the camera just is static. It doesn't move. Yeah. This camera is constantly in motion, and it's like I think that's honestly what contributes to a lot of the Spanish Dracula is the better movie because it's just a better movie to look at.
Well, and from a filmmaking standpoint, the fact that they shot this in about 3 weeks and in overnights, and the camera does stay so fluid is shocking because that is no small feat. Because that's a lot of setup time, that's a lot of work to have, executed. But also with a giant film camera, those cameras were not as portable as they used to be.
And there was no like dolly track or anything like that. It's just like this camera was just kind of like on a swivel and like on just something with casters on the bottom of it rolling around the set.
Yeah, I think dynamic is the best way to describe it. It's a lot of these scenes in Browning's version, they feel very stagey. They feel like, you have these kind of big opulent sets, but they still feel like stage sets. Whereas in this one, I feel like there's a lot more dimension, particularly in Dracula's Castle is a big one. In Carfax Abbey, like there's these sort of big cavernous spaces. I think Robinson's cinematography gives these locations a lot more dimension. And then you'll get in the other one. I think that was really what I responded to the most, is that he manages to use the space and the lighting to much greater effect than I think Browning does.
Yeah. So, Dracula by Bram Stoker, written in 1897, one of the most famous pieces of English literature of all time. Captivated the English-speaking world. Certainly not the first horror novel to use vampires as the central monster, but it is the most widely distributed. In 1922, Franz Murnau, who attempts to license Dracula for a motion picture, was rejected by the Stoker estate. He makes a few minor changes to the story and characters and releases Nosferatu. The Stoker,
also notably a very good friend of Kohner.
Oh yeah, okay, because Kohner came into Hollywood from Germany.
Yep. And he was like I think it was a big influence. And again, you can see that in this version.
Yep. The Stoker estate sues and judge orders all known copies of Nosferatu destroyed. Just ballsy. In 24, Stoker estate grants permission to Hamilton Dean, one of Stoker's contemporaries, at the Lyceum Theatre in London, and he produces the first stage play of Dracula. 3 years later, the production moves to Broadway, casting Bela Lugosi in the lead role of Dracula. And then in 1930, Carl Laemmle Jr. is looking to introduce a huge picture in the same scope and tradition of his father's productions of The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. For the sound era, he secures the exclusive rights to literally all things Dracula in the United States.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting how they go from absolutely not, we'll never make a film to, yeah, sure, here you go, here's all of it.
You know what it was? Is their cases
Money?
against Murnau, they had costs that had to be paid. And so when this guy came along who was a friend of Bram Stoker's, they were like, yeah, I guess it's cool.
My favorite Dracula fact is that when the book was first published, a lot of people were like, this story seems a little homosexual. And he was like, homosexual? What are you talking about? And they were like, wait a minute, aren't you? And he was like, no, I'm not a homosexual. Absolutely not. How dare you? Oh, my God.
Yep.
It's great.
But there are some letters to Walt Whitman that might raise some questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
He ran right back into the closet.
Just slammed the door behind him. Mm-hmm. Man, a terribly kinky story as well. A lot of domination going on.
Yep.
Original plans were for Conrad Veidt to play Dracula. Then he backed out, relocated to Germany. Lon Chaney was next in line, but problems arose in 1930 when he died rather suddenly.
That would have been difficult.
Yeah. And then a parade of other actors went before Universal while Bela Lugosi lobbied hard to win for the role, which is crazy. Like, they did not want him to be in that movie.
He's fine, I guess.
I think he's
Real
great. He's the
hammy.
reason everybody does that version of Dracula. You know, when you get a Dracula Halloween costume, you get basically a Bela Lugosi costume.
Yeah, I think that for book purists, or maybe just by the time he had already done it on stage, it was that thing where he was just maybe a little too old to have played the character of Dracula. But he's also so iconic, you can't argue with the pop culture results, right?
Right, yeah. No way.
Listen, my favorite Dracula, not Bela Lugosi.
It's John...
Fuck yeah, it is.
God, why am I blanking on his last name?
Carradine.
John Carradine. John Carradine is your favorite Dracula?
My favorite Dracula, John Carradine.
My God, that's weird. Not even Christopher Lee?
Yeah, Christopher Lee's mine.
Yeah.
But,
He's my second favorite.
Carradine did some fun Dracula moments, for sure.
That's funny. We mentioned it. Browning's Dracula production was an absolute shit show from the jump. Had every producer in the studio all over it to make sure that it finished on time and on budget. But the Spanish language version used this to their advantage. The production had significantly less oversight, and Melford and Villarreal were able to watch the dailies and either fix or improve on the day's shots. And you can definitely see how they reassessed what was going on in some of these. But yeah, for years, this was considered a lost movie until the 1970s when a print was found in a New Jersey warehouse.
Well, most of a print was found, a truncated version.
So the print was in mint condition, but there was a problem. It was missing a reel. The reel was eventually recovered in the late 1980s in Havana, Cuba, and a restoration was done in 1992. Now
they had the way they had to do this because of the way that relations between the U.S. and Cuba are. They weren't allowed to have any direct dealings with the Cubans. They had to have someone at UCLA do it because academic institutions are allowed to have certain relationships with the Cuban government. So they had to have an intermediary do this, which was fine because I think they wanted to use UCLA's film department to do the restoration anyway. And you can really see the difference because they have their print that they got in New Jersey. It really is a pristine print.
Oh sure, you could scan a 4K from it. It's that
the
good.
reel from Cuba looks like it was sitting in the basement. Yeah, and it is a rough transition from one reel to the next because you can really see it.
Yeah. We'll point it out when we get to that part of the story, but because it's a real janky version. But yeah, this movie opened in Cuba in March of 1931, which is a crazy fact because whenever I see that, I'm like, oh yeah, the communist Cuba. And then I have to remind myself, I was like, no, that was in the 50s. So
yeah. Anything pre-57, which was when the revolution happens, everything before that is the Americans use that basically as a sexy Disneyland. You could just go directly there. You go to Havana, there were that's why the mob was so influential there. Americans pretty much owned at a certain point, towards the end, owned most of Havana. It's a kind of a sad story, and that is eventually how Fidel Castro ends up taking over, is that he's able to sort of rally the people who were discontented with what was happening there, and then it all kind of falls apart. But yeah, everything before that is just like, it was a hot place to be.
Mm-hmm. Hot happening, jazz music 24/7. Mm-hmm. So were there reviews of this?
It was tough to find. So this movie was generally well received. Mostly the Lupita Tovar's performance is pretty popular. I did find one, and it is from the LA Times, because I think where this was shown in the U.S. was probably in like Los Angeles.
Oh, for sure,
would be my guess. Like that's probably
it ran in major cities. So
the best I could find was LA Times. And it's just sort of a small piece. It just says, there is little to be said about so familiar a story, except that it should be well received wherever shown. For although being very exciting at times, it nevertheless is rather good entertainment. And I feel like that's about as high praise as you can get.
Rather good is it's great description.
For though it is very exciting at times, it is nevertheless rather good.
That's interesting, because Dracula did not review well. People were mostly offended by the fact that it was a horror movie. And like reviewers were put off by the fact that it was like scary. So
what were they expecting?
I don't fucking know. But yeah. So shall we jump in?
Yeah, I think that's
all right.
All we got.
So we open on the most violent carriage ride of all time as Renfield travels through the mountainous Transylvanian country on his way to meet a carriage at Borgo Pass that will take him to his destination, Castillo Dracula.
This is also where we get Carla Lemley, who is she's either the only one or one of two people that is in both movies.
Yep.
There are two, and that happens later on, but they're kind of unappreciated roles, for lack of a better term.
Yeah,
I think she's great in this. I think she's better in this one than she is in Browning's.
Yeah. She's the woman who is reading about Transylvania to sort of fill us in on the place that we're going, and she's constantly falling on Renfield because that carriage is getting tossed.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they're racing to their destination in order to make it by nightfall, today being Walpurgisnacht. The night brings terrible evils, like vampires. And when they arrive at their first stop, the local peasants freak out at the mention of Borgo Pass. They try to dissuade Renfield from visiting Conde Dracula. But that night, he insists that he resume his trip.
Now, my question is, look, if you guys know that Conde Dracula is a bit of a problem for the area, why don't you do something about it?
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of an issue in both versions of this movie, where everybody really wants to point out, oh, you shouldn't go there. Like, we think that it would be better if you stay. And then when he says, I'd like to go, they're like, fine, that's great. Like, that no one kind of jumps in with additional information, which they seemingly must have, because they're all very concerned. But, I mean, no one ever at any point says, yo, you'll die. They're just like, oh, we think it's a little spooky, or maybe wait till morning. That's it.
I know. Yeah. Drop the V word. Just give it to him. Let him know.
There's a lot of like, no, sir. No. You're really... okay, fine.
Yep, pretty much.
Yeah. One of the locals gives Renfield a cross to wear. And then we get some more shots of him like passing up to the castle. There's a really interesting night shot.
I fucking love this part because this is not in Browning's version. Well, so on the way up, so he's in the carriage, in the bouncy carriage on his way to the other bouncy carriage. And it's the way that the shot is lit. It looks like there's sort of darkness closing in around him as the carriage moves along. And that scene is not in Browning's version.
No. But then they cut to that scene where there's just like this big fire burning on the hillside, and the way that it's shot is just very evocative. There's like bands of light like rising out of it. It's such a cool shot that I wanted to point out.
And I think that a restoration probably made it cooler on accident because if you're thinking about seeing that on celluloid, those beams of light, which would clearly be giant Klieg lights pointing up to kind of like highlight the fire, that would have been sort of lost in sort of the projection, so it would have been just like a bigger glow. Whereas with this restoration, we can quite clearly see, there are electric lights behind the fire that are giving it this otherworldly thing. But it's a happy accident, many, many decades later, that just makes it all the more surreal when he comes upon it.
It's one of those rare moments where a 4K restoration it makes you actually go, hey, cool, instead of like, oh, that's sad.
Yeah.
Right. Also, amazing matte paintings here. These are different matte.
The matte paintings in this movie are incredible.
These are different matte paintings from Browning's version.
Really?
Yep.
I feel like that would have taken a long time.
But then,
so the other difference here is that when he gets to the second carriage, and the guy basically just like fucking boots him out of the thing. He's like, see ya, good luck. Is that in the original one, Lugosi has on like a weird ski mask or something. Like his head is wrapped, but you can see his face. So it's very clearly that this is Dracula.
Right.
I mean, you don't know that you actually haven't seen him yet, but eventually you'll put the two and two together. In this one, though, they cover his mouth. And so a lot of his face is covered, so you really don't know that it's him.
Well, except that he's got that goofy look on his face.
Yeah, he does have a bit of a just got hit with a 2x4, kind of like a cartoon
A lot of
look.
the times, like Carlos Villarreal, he looks like he sat on his keys or something. Like his look is the look on his face is always very, very silly.
Yeah.
So yes.
And I don't know that they're really trying to obscure the fact that it's him. I mean, yeah, he's wearing a covered face. He's obscuring it from Renfield, but we do get to see Dracula wake up before this.
Yes.
Sort of like, there is that whole inference, well, he's getting up for a reason. He's not setting the table. He's going to go get his guest.
It's a little more subtle.
They give him that moment where he looks like the shadow.
Essentially.
Yeah, it does look like the shadow.
So we cut to Castillo de Dracula. A coffin on the dirt floor opens, and the single claw-like hand emerges. And then elsewhere in the crypt, a box opens, and amid a plume of mist, Conde Dracula rises with his brides.
And this is right on the edge of being cheesy. Like, this is a real thin line, and they pull it off.
They do it because they do
could have gone
Dracula
either way.
rising from his coffin like a bunch of times. I love it every time it happens.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, because we never really see Lugosi do that.
No. This is like one of the notes during my research that I kept coming across was like, this is the one that shows him coming out of the box.
Yep.
Which makes me wonder like how much of Murnau's Nosferatu had an influence on this, because like that's
a shitload.
That notably happens many times in that one, and it's badass every time it happens.
Yeah, because Murnau was a huge influence on Kohner. Even though they were very good friends, he was a big influence on like his style and his aesthetic.
Yeah. So at Borgo Pass, the coachman tosses Renfield's bags, rides off quickly. Dracula's coach is waiting with a cochero that looks an awful lot like Conde Dracula in disguise. Renfield gets in, and off they go. And after a time, he looks out the window at El Cochero and finds that the coach is being driven by 2 horses and a floppy prop bat.
It's very much like Dark Shadows.
Yeah, I love the bat leading the carriage, though.
It's
I think
super
it's great.
cool. It's such a cool idea, too, yeah. Like, I mean, I don't know why he would do that. It's just like a neat detail that they were like, oh, shit, we got to do this for the movie.
Yeah, it's good.
Yep. So when he arrives at El Castillo de Dracula, Renfield is greeted by a crumbling facade and huge doors that open on their own. Inside is a cavernous stone ruin and a huge staircase blocked by a massive spider web. And at first, no one is there, but when he looks away and back, he suddenly finds Conde Dracula waiting for him.
Just grinning down all goofy like on him.
This is, to me, one of the best visuals of this movie. That having him behind the spider web the whole time is a really, really great use of that set piece, because in the Browning version, the spider web's there, but it doesn't quite have the impact that it does here. And Lugosi comes down the stairs.
Oh, is he?
No,
I'm sorry, go.
And whereas here, it sort of forces Renfield to go and meet Dracula at the web, like essentially a fly going into the spider's web. And I think that they really utilize this in such a better way than the Browning movie, because in the Browning movie, it's sort of like 4-H Club haunted house spider web, where it
looks like a cheap decoration.
It's spooky set dressing. Whereas this is part of the character. This is the first time you see it. He's a predator in a web. The web even looks better. It's a bigger, kind of more constructed web. And for some of the one-sheet posters that were made for this, that's the image they used. They used that web very, very distinctly. So they knew that this was kind of the defining introduction for this version of Dracula.
No kidding. Is that how? Because the way that I experience the scene is Dracula is in front of the web, and then at the part where they go upstairs, he seems to like pass through the web undaunted.
That may be true, but I do know that he never leaves the vicinity of the web. So maybe in my brain I'm placing him on one side or the other. But Lugosi, if you go back and watch the same scene, he kind of like walks past it and comes down the stairs, and the web is really not integral to the scene at all, other than, this castle's a mess.
Yeah.
Yep. And what I love about that is that so forcing him to walk through this, it's a bit of a power play, but also the thing that I think Villarreal does really well in this movie is that he sort of conveys a contempt for humanity. I mean, he is a real cheesy, hammy actor through most of this movie, but he's very good at conveying this kind of contemptuous feeling, especially with Renfield, where he's like, he seems to hate humanity. And you can see that throughout, whereas I don't think Lugosi really does that, because he just sort of has a stare and a stance. But he does not convey much with his face.
Yeah, no, I'll give you that. Particularly later on, like when he's at Carfax Abbey and he's in Whitby, like making a mess of things, like he becomes a lot less hammy and more threatening.
Yeah.
So amid some long, lingering takes of Conde Dracula's hammy expression, Dracula draws Renfield's attention to the howling of the wolves nearby, and he passes through a huge spider web without breaking it. Renfield is forced to chop it away with his cane. And that's when he says, "Escúchalos, los hijos de la noche." I love that part. So they retire to a significantly nicer setting in the castle, the dining room, where Dracula and Renfield look over the contract to lease Carfax Abbey back in Whitby. Dracula invites Renfield to dine on food waiting for him, drink some wine, and then, as if to prove what a fool Renfield is, he reiterates their rather shady deal. No one knows that.
Now here's the thing. Does it never occur to him, like, these are some real red flaggy requests he's making?
Yep.
Now nobody knows you're here, right? You made sure to burn all of our correspondence?
Yes.
He sounds like he's on To Catch a Predator.
I know. This all seems on the up and up, right?
Well, I mean, he's a fool, especially for somebody who's been generally alarmed by doors opening since he's been
that is
at the place.
That is worth mentioning. Like, whenever something spooky happens, Renfield throws himself against the scenery, like, in terror. It's great.
Yeah, well,
he is
to jump on it, he needs to eat it all.
He is acting at an 11 throughout this entire movie.
Yeah. What I do love about this moment, though, so this scene is pretty much identical to what happens in the Browning's version, except there's no eating in that one.
Oh yeah.
And what I find really interesting is that so Renfield is eating this food, and he's really ravenous in the way that he's eating. Like, he's sort of ripping into everything, and that's how he ends up cutting his finger, is that he's sort of tearing things apart, because he cuts a loaf of bread like an idiot. He cuts it like he's like cutting an apple or something. He's like pulls the knife toward him or something like that.
Yeah, very, very bad knife etiquette.
But that's how the way that he is behaving with food is also the way that Dracula then behaves when he sees the blood. And so there's this sort of, like, one is ravenous for food, and then the other becomes ravenous when he sees blood. It makes it a much more effective moment than I think Browning's version, where it's just sort of like, I don't drink wine.
Yeah, he says,
like, it's that. Like,
yo nunca bebo vino. Yeah. So Renfield accidentally cuts himself on a bread knife. El Conde becomes excited at the sight of blood and stalks all upon Renfield's shit until he's driven away by the cross he was given back in the village.
They also don't do that thing where the light drops over. So like, throughout Browning's version, the light comes over Lugosi's eyes all the time.
Oh, yeah, the light band.
Not really sure when, but like it just happens throughout it. And they don't do that in this one.
Nope.
And I think that is also to their benefit, because it always feels a little bit cheesy, because it's like, is this the best you've got?
Ooh,
You're a fucking stage actor.
Shit about the light band? I love that quality.
Oh.
But I think something that's really interesting, especially in retrospect, when looking at this particular performance of Dracula, and it is very ham-fisted in some ways. I mean, there's no question. But even with the light and the differences between what Lugosi made so pop culturally definitive, they didn't have that yet. So we're really looking at someone who's interpreting the idea of a arch villain from a book that was previously on stage, where stage actors tend to do things big. I'm sure that Carlos Villarreal was probably just like, I'm doing it here. I'm doing the thing, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And I love how untethered to any other performance of Dracula his version of Dracula is, for better or worse.
It's definitely his version of Dracula. Like this portrayal of Dracula is a sort of analogous to Lugosi's version. Like it's just sort of like that fate that kind of made it like, you know, the English language version had a broader reach, and that's why.
Because they could have. They were like, "Hey, do you want to do the light thing?" And he was like, "No, I got this. We don't need that.
Oh yeah,
I'm gonna do my thing, and it's gonna be better." And I think actually that is. I'm joking a little bit, but I think they make a lot of smart choices in this that I think Browning and Karl Freund just didn't do. Whether it was a limitation on resources or there was too much infighting, whatever the fucking reason was, it doesn't matter. I think that they make a lot of really smart decisions in this movie, this version, that elevates it just a little bit more. I think they're a little more creative, and they take a few more risks that really pay off. And I think one of those is being like, hey, this is a gothic romance, essentially. Go nuts.
Yeah.
And they do. Because I think that the Lugosi's, I can't believe I'm about to say this, Lugosi's performance is a little bit understated in certain parts, because he doesn't have a lot of range. He has a face that is static the whole time. Like, doesn't do much. Whereas Villarreal, his face is doing everything.
I know.
His face work is.
Bela Lugosi's face looks kind of like when Ozzy Osbourne smiles. And Villarreal's face is kind of like Jim Carrey doing Dracula.
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
So as they look over the documents for Carfax Abbey, Renfield is overcome with, I don't know, sickness, drunkenness. In the novel and other film versions, the fate of Jonathan Harker takes up about half of the story. Here, Renfield immediately falls under Dracula's power.
Yeah.
And this is where the rough, recovered footage from Havana comes in, because all of a sudden this like pristine, like beautiful black and white presentation is just like blurry and janky. Like they did their best to make it work. It sticks out like a sore thumb.
But I'm glad it's there, because I think that this particular moment, even though it was lost, these are some of the biggest differences from the Browning version.
Oh, I know. I'd have been bummed if all of a sudden there was just a card that was like missing reel. You know?
Yeah.
From the balcony, Renfield witnesses Dracula loading the coffins onto a coach, passes out as Dracula's brides descend on him. So now, God, I wish there were more of the brides in there, because they are very, very spooky in this movie.
They are much more sort of unnerving than they are in the original, or than Browning's version.
Yeah.
Well, them sort of waiting as Renfield watches at the window, kind of ravenously preying upon him, is one of the best kind of visual moments of this portion of the
that
film.
Specifically is the one that made me like really kind of hungry for more of them, because unfortunately, like, that's the best we get. Like, this is the last we see of them.
But it's also one of the strengths of this movie. I mean, as I've already said, there's a lot of sort of languid looks that they give each other, but they're not afraid to just linger on stuff.
Mm-hmm. Oh, say a couple of a ship captain and his first mate's faces.
Which that's my favorite part of this entire film, is the Demeter. But yeah, I think the fact that they're willing to just sort of like let the camera sit, and you just sort of have to look at it. And I don't know what the equivalent would be now, but in 1931, some of this shit was probably pretty upsetting to look at. And so I think that's one of the ways it makes it feel like a horror movie and not just a gothic romance.
Yeah, there are moments toward the end that I'll probably point out when we get there that, like, I would, obviously this is not a scary movie, but there are moments in it where I do find some of the presentations, the characterizations of like a person sort of turning to the dark side as being like a little unnerving. Like it gets under your skin just a little bit in a way that like a lot of horror movies don't. So yeah. Later aboard the Demeter, the captain and mate pilot the ship through a brutal storm. As the storm rages, Conde Dracula rises from his coffin as the ship crew watches in horror, while Renfield howls with laughter from a window looking over
it
the
is
deck.
really like I don't know how to describe it, but watching him sort of madly cackling through this porthole while they cut back and forth between the coffin opening and then Renfield cackling, and just the dudes on the ship, like the deck of the ship, realizing what's happening, because you don't really see what happens in Browning's version. You just see a raging storm, and you see a boat getting tossed around in a little bathtub, and then we just cut to the guy being tied to the steering wheel. Yep. But in this one, you still don't see what happens. I think there was a couple scenes that got cut from... I don't know if they were just too badly damaged or whatever. There are other scenes where you see Villarreal. I think he's on the bow of the ship and like his cape is sort of flapping in the wind.
Ooh, that'd be badass.
And he's making a very like a sort of triumphant moment. And then you see a couple of the guys like throw themselves into the water, which is what happens in the book, is they sort of throw themselves over rather than be attacked by this thing. But you still get that sense that like, oh, he killed everybody.
Yeah.
And he was like watching, and Renfield is watching and sort of just wildly laughing while it's happening. It's like, that's the part, like you don't get that in Browning's version. And that's the horror of it, is that these people seem so refined until all of a sudden they're not, they're monsters.
Yeah. And it's such a great, like the way that shot of particularly Renfield in the window is easily like this movie's version of Dwight Fry at the bottom of the hold laughing,
which is one of my favorite moments in any movie ever.
Oh yeah, same. Like this is definitely like their version of that, although it's like way over the top.
Yeah. And unfortunately, like Dwight Fry, I was telling you this earlier, Dwight Fry is, there are things about both versions that I like a lot. Dwight Fry, I think, is outstanding in that film. And the guy who plays Renfield in this, it's a different performance. It's a bigger performance, that's for sure. But it does not hold a candle to Dwight Fry, because I feel like Dwight Fry, his embodiment of all of that is really, it is sort of upsetting in a lot of ways. He makes it's a laugh. It's clearly he's laughing, but it's almost like he's laughing, but almost crying.
Oh yeah, it's
manic.
He's screaming.
And it is so upsetting, like, because he does it a lot, and he switches back and forth. The way his mood and sort of temperament switch really hard in Browning's version, and it's very subtle when he does it. In this version, it is not so. You can see these personality changes coming from a mile away, and he just smacks you right in the face with it every time.
One does wonder, though, if that's just sort of actors feeding off each other. Carlos Villarreal certainly set the bar for how far you can push your heightened presentation in this movie, and I think that a lot of the actors in this movie are just trying to match him, for better or worse. And I think that sometimes that's to the detriment of a movie, that sometimes someone makes a big choice and everyone thinks that they have to get on that level, when in fact we don't need that from Renfield.
Right.
But these are the two dynamic characters, and I'm sure he was like, all right, well, he's going there, I'm going to go to 11 too.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that the whole character of Renfield, he's this sort of pathetic creature, this lowly thing. And when he's sort of doing a 1-for-1 and trying to match that energy and trying to sort of be an equal, it just doesn't work. Like it just feels like he's not, I hate to say that he's not doing it right, because this one actually came out first, so nobody would have really known, but like, it just doesn't feel right in that character. And I don't think you would necessarily have to be that familiar with the book or the story to know that it's not the right performance.
I still love it. I still think he's great.
I mean, he's not bad. It's not the same. It doesn't feel right to me. It does not feel unnerving like the character of Renfield is supposed to be. It's more Tom Waits Renfield than...
That's true.
Or Tom Waits in real life, I'm sure.
Yeah. So when they arrive at port the next day, the Demeter is a ghost ship, and the crew having died of fright and passage. When authorities open up the hold, they find Renfield below deck, just raving like a maniac. This is what I
My
said.
only question when in all versions of this, they find Renfield raving like a maniac, but like, did no one look in any of the boxes?
I know.
Because when they leave, he's like, no, I'm only taking 3 boxes. Oh, they also happen to be full of ladies.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah, like this is what I was talking about earlier is like I think Melford watched the dailies of Dwight Fry and was like, he's way too understated.
Yeah, let's go big.
Yep. So later, El Conde rises from the crypt below Carfax Abbey, heads out to the Opera House to take in some culture.
And he's a real smooth operator, this Conde Dracula.
Oh, yeah. At the Opera House, seeing Eva in the company of her boo, Juan Harker, Father Dr. Seward, and friend Lucia Weston, Dracula hatches a plot to insinuate himself into their affairs. He uses his gaze to dominate a hostess at the Opera House who lures Dr. Seward into the hallway so that they may meet, and is then invited to watch the opera as their guest. Dracula then proceeds to creep everybody out with musings on the topic of death.
And just like long stares at them. Like he's just like looks at Juan Harker. He's just like staring at him. I'm like, God damn, stop it.
And they're all talking during the middle of the performance. Where's my theater etiquette here?
Well, and so in Browning's version, it's the intermission.
Yeah.
Like it's very clearly because they flash the lights right before the scene cuts away. In this one, it's clearly just going on stage, and they're just like blah 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 blah.
The people in the neighboring boxes are just like, God, shut up.
It's like we went to see Fabio Frizzi, and they did the live score for Zombie a couple weeks ago, and a bunch of people sitting watching the movie, watching Fabio Frizzi. The other side of the bar, just fucking carrying on like they're just out at the bar. I'm like, really?
I know.
Tonight you're doing that?
Yeah.
They were those people.
Yeah, something wrong with your lips?
Yeah, truly. Maybe this is a subtle early indicator that we can't trust Dracula as if we didn't just see the castle, because he has no regard for his fellow audience members.
Yep.
Oh. Yeah, he's not as smooth as I thought he was.
Yeah.
He's got no chill. So sometime later, Eva busts Lucia's chops about being so into Conde Dracula. And then...
Which I could not help but think of, I don't know if either of you watched Dark Shadows, but like every plot line in Dark Shadows is pulled from one of these stories. And this one is like the original story from Dark Shadows. And I just kept thinking about that the whole time.
Yeah.
So, as if by happenstance, Dracula passes by her place and flies through her open window as a floppy prop bat. As she sleeps, creeping up on her shit, and then pouncing. So
and it's interesting. So this is Lucia, right?
Yeah.
Real low cut outfit. So the only costumes they didn't reuse were the women's costumes.
Yeah.
Because in this one they are quite a bit more revealing.
Oh, these are very sexy 1931 dresses.
It's because they didn't have to deal with the Hays Code because these were international pictures.
Yeah.
I think it's Lucy that he sort of descends on her and like covers her with his cape.
Yeah.
As he bites her. So in the I think they just don't even show it in the Browning's version. Or if they do, they sort of show his face get closer and then they cut to black. But I think it's so much more effective to show him sort of descend upon her and like engulf her in this way. It's a lot darker, and the implication I think is a little bit more disturbing, which again makes it more effective and reminds you that you're watching a horror movie.
Oh, right. Because a little later on, they're going to follow through on that in the way that Browning's does not, but they also kind of drop the ball on it, which is a little disappointing. The next day in an operating theater, the surgeon announces Lucia dead, pointing out that she's mysteriously a few pints low on blood, and they spot a pair of bite marks on her neck. In the lab, Dr. Van Helsing inspects her blood sample and announces that it couldn't be more clear they're dealing with a vampire, to which his associates react with exasperation, like, dude, this shit again?
Yeah, Dr. Van Helsing, played by Mexican Eugene Levy.
This is also the scene with the other actor who was also in Browning's version, the guy who says Nosferatu, John George. He kind of does the exact same thing in the Browning version, except he's on opposite sides of the table. Ooh. So in the Browning version, he is on the left, and in this movie, he's on the right.
Gotcha.
What do you suppose the reason for including him in this? Do you think he was just there that day, and they were like, hey, why don't you get in this scene?
That's a great question. I
Like,
hope you
why
got paid for
else?
both.
Why would you just include this like bit part of a guy who has one line in this movie?
Van Helsing's proof is that Dr. Seward is treating a dude who just returned from Transylvania with a mania that makes him think that he has to drink blood to stay alive. So at the sanitarium, Martin, Renfield's keeper, struggles to pull him screaming from the bars on his window as he's about to eat a spider.
Oh, you mean Mexican Fred Mertz?
Yes.
Yeah, the inclusion of Martin. Martin is one of the characters that definitely deviates from the Browning version, because he's one of the characters that adds to that 30-minute runtime. Apparently, someone felt like we needed some comic levity, and it had to be this guy.
I know. They were like, this is all too morose. We need some laughs up here. Let's get some real
he
yucks going.
He's in Browning's version, though. He's just it's not as much.
Well, but we keep getting all of these scenes where he's like, hey, crazy people,
Yes.
am I right?
Yep. Martin introduces Renfield to Van Helsing. He's very lucid until he spots a fly on the wall, and he tries to eat it before everybody's horrified expression. And they talk some more about his condition. He thinks that the wolves that howl at night are talking to him. And then Van Helsing produces a sprig of wolfsbane, which drives him mad with fear. At home, go.
I was just saying, does Van Helsing just travel with that? Or he probably brought it because of his office declaration.
Yeah, he's like, listen, we got some vampires. I better get some wolfsbane. He just got it all in his pocket and shit.
He does seem unusually prepared for all of this. He's like, I knew it was going to happen sooner or later.
Yeah, it's only a matter of time before a Dracula shows up.
Not a Dracula.
Or better that than Dracula's.
At home, Juan comforts Ava, sad from the loss of Lucia, but also frightened all the time for reasons that she can't understand.
And look, Juan Harker, I feel like this character in the movies is probably just kind of a dud in general. Like, he's just supposed to, he's a romantic lead.
Right,
He's kind of
it's
a backdrop.
why they swapped him out for Renfield going to Transylvania, because they needed somebody for the Mina Eva character to sort of run to.
Yeah. And man, I think I'm going to go, for me, David Manners wins it in Browning's version, but that's only because I'm just sticking with the gays on this one. Because they're both like, ugh, you guys suck.
Yeah, they're wet blanket characters for sure. And they really, as far as comforting the Mina/Ava, not very good at it.
No.
Oh, God, no. It's a very 1930s appropriate.
I'm surprised he doesn't shake her at any point.
A little condescending.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Although I do love, with Lucy and Lucia both, the idea that they just kind of disappear. It's like, well, she's dead, and that actress got to go home.
Yeah.
Never again to be seen.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving on, everybody, let's go.
So, Ava describes a nightmare she had, which sounds like she was visited in the night by Conde Dracula. And in the morning, she felt so weak. Then Van Helsing enters the scene with Dr. Seward, and they talk about the dream. She reveals that she has a mark on her neck like Lucia's.
Okay, couple of things here. They don't actually show the teeth marks in Browning's version, which I think is interesting.
Right.
But they do in this one. And
they're tiny.
If this is Dracula's teeth marks, Dracula has very tiny teeth.
Yeah.
Because they're right next to each other, and they're real small.
Yeah. Although that, in some ways, matches more the Murnau Nosferatu fangs.
Oh, right, because they're up front.
Buck teeth fangs, yeah. I mean, we don't get fangs on Dracula cinematically until Dracula in Istanbul. That's the first time he has fangs on screen. Because in this movie, there's just a lot of here are my teeth, big grin, but no Sharpie sharp.
Yeah. As they talk, El Conde arrives. Van Helsing goes on the offensive, and Dracula tries to put Eva's mind at ease about her fears, assuring her that she's just taking the stories of his homeland a little too seriously. And then Harker steps in, alarmed at Dracula, and Eva seem to be kicking it. And Dracula turns on his heel and gives Harker a look that practically says, "Bitch, was I talking to you?" Yeah.
See, this is when his ability to go big or go home really comes in handy.
Yeah.
Because he is giving everybody a look. He has got a look for every emotion. And it's pretty great.
Yeah. Then he pieces out for the night. As he leaves, Van Helsing looks at the reflection of Eva in a cigarette box mirror, but finds that Dracula has no reflection. So Van Helsing has him come back into the living room and tricks him into looking into the mirror, which enrages him.
Well, he says it enrages him. They say he looked like an enraged beast, but he looks more to me like he can't decide if he's an enraged beast or if he wants to stamp his feet and run out of the room crying.
Yeah, if enraged beast is like telenovela grand dame, then that is where we're at.
Yeah, he's got like a real sulky face.
Yeah, but he smashes that box with his cane.
He does.
Yeah. So after he leaves, Van Helsing tells Seward and Harker that he's a vampire, and they too think he's a lunatic. Speaking of lunatics, they also find Renfield wandering around out in the garden. Van Helsing tries to cut a deal with him to narc on Dracula, but Renfield is in too deep and he won't give it up.
Yeah, see, his Renfield it's more Rain Man than Renfield to me. Maybe with like a touch of Harpo Marx. Like,
I'll give you the Harpo Marx.
Something there that's so big and confusing.
Yeah,
that it's like you don't even really need to speak. You're doing it all with your arms and your face.
Yeah, that actor's I finally came into it in the notes. That actor's name is Pablo Alvarez Rubio, and I think he's great. Once again, Conde Dracula rises from the crypt. By night, Eva walks out into the fog in a fugue state to the waiting arms of Dracula. After a lot of
Now, this is another good example of those differences because this feels like a very erotic scene.
Yeah.
Where she sort of goes to him and he embraces her and she's got this low-cut dress and like it feels very like what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Rather than, him like luring her in with a fishing rod or whatever he does in Browning's version.
Yeah, that is the thing is like this book, like this story, sexy as hell,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Not every screen adaptation though is sexy.
No. Let's see.
Jack Palance is Dracula.
Oh,
what?
Man.
No.
And they try with Frank Langella,
Nobody can make Frank Langella sexy.
Although I think that movie, the 79 Dracula with Langella, is gorgeously shot. It is one of the most beautiful versions.
A lot of billowing sheets and like window dressings and stuff. That was the very first Dracula I ever saw.
It's the gothic-iest of them all.
Yeah. Well, especially there was the theatrical cut that has beautiful color, and then the director's cut desaturates it, which is a bit crazy. It's the only time that I think that the director might have been like, maybe he was hypnotized by Dracula because what are you trying to do? Take the color out of your movie? This movie works because it's colorful.
Yeah.
That's the only thing it has going for it.
So after a lot of chatter with Renfield, the housekeeper finds Eva's body and passes out. Everybody except for Renfield go to get her, finding her passed out in the garden. Eva, that is.
Now this is where another place where Dwight Fry's Renfield really excels because he sort of drops to the ground and crawls over to her like an animal, and he looks like he's about to do something to her, and they cut away before he does whatever it is he's going to do, and it just doesn't work with Rubio. It just doesn't feel the same. Like he never feels menacing to me, whereas I think Fry's Renfield is a mix of pathetic and frightening. And
Right.
This guy never feels like either. He just feels like he's sort of like Wacko from the Animaniacs. He's just in your face the whole time. And
Yeah,
doing
but I don't want to
thing.
be alone in a room with Wacko either, to be honest.
I mean, I don't think he would either eat or sexually assault me, but it's just too much. It's like any subtlety that would make, because the whole point of a lot of this is that it's these subtle changes that make them scary.
Yeah, that's true.
It's going from this sort of gentlemanly Eastern European man to a monster. That's what's frightening. And when you are just constantly at an 11, it's like I can't notice these changes because every single one of them you're swinging for the fences. And it's just like with the character like this, these moments kind of matter. And I just don't get it with him because he's just like, ah!
Yeah, he's like the guy, the Leo is getting larger guy from Airplane. Like that's what his performance is like.
Yeah, I guess.
Yep. Van Helsing warns everybody that she is still very much under Dracula's power, and that to free her, they have to confront Dracula and kill him. Now, Martin later reads a news story to the hospital staff about a mysterious woman in white who stalks the streets by night, luring children to their fates with candy and then drinking their blood.
Which is dark as hell.
Yeah. This is the part that, like, is left out almost entirely from Browning's version.
Well, they do it in Browning's version, but they do it with Martin reading it in the paper. And it's just he does it with like a little bit of a jokey tone. And so it's not as upsetting, but like this is a time in Los Angeles where shit like this was happening a lot,
right?
Where like people were luring children away and they would find like their half-eaten fucking body somewhere, like some other horrible shit had happened to them. And so it's like this is a very, very upsetting moment, and they don't do it very well in Browning's version.
Well, and I don't want to assume, but also because this is being made for a Latin market and folklore is so important to so many of the cultures represented within the film, there is a little bit of a La Llorona sort of thing happening with the way he reads the story of the woman in white who takes your children, which is very prevalent in some of these countries. And so I thought of that when I was hearing this version of it, because it is kind of a beat that hits and they move right past in Browning's version, but they linger on this. They want to sell the idea that this is really, a thing.
Yeah. But also this is the detail that I think that sort of adjacent adaptations of other sort of vampire fiction tends to play with the most. Like a big part of it is, as good as these movies are, there is kind of a huge hole in the plot, in that Dracula's ultimate intention, like his plan, is never really established. Like, what is he doing, right? Because he comes to Whitby originally because he's kind of run out of options to feed in Transylvania. Like, everybody stays away. Everybody's like a horse, like half a horse, like a ride a day away, from Castle Dracula. So like he has to leave his homeland to go to another place in order to feed. And so like because he's a foreigner, he's rather conspicuous, and so he needs like other people to kind of do his work for him. And that's really what Lucia is doing here, supposedly. I've read some analysis of these where it's believed that she was the one who went out and she was infecting children effectively in order to have them sort of then spread the disease to parents and stuff like that, which made it easier for Dracula to move around. Because in the original story, it's not 3 boxes of dirt that he brings. It's like 50, and he stuffs them. He stashes them all over town so that he's always got an option to eat and a place to crash.
Well, that's what I love about Herzog's version of Nosferatu.
Yes.
It's very clear about a lot of those parts of the story, but also that like this is essentially Dracula's death drive. He really does. He wants to die. He just can't do it, and so he's sort of spreading this plague. He just wants to destroy everything because he's kind of angry, and also he wants to eat people, but also he doesn't really want to live anymore. He's kind of ambivalent about it all.
Yeah,
and I think they for a lot of different reasons, they're not going to do that in 1931. But I also feel like that might have been a little bit too complicated a plot for audiences in 1931.
Sure. Plus, but also hurting children is still very taboo, right?
Right. But I do think, especially at this time, but also when Stoker wrote the book, there are themes of xenophobia that are so prevalent in how this is constructed. The idea of a person coming from a foreign land and bringing a plague or bringing a notion that will undermine modern civilization or what the reader views as proper civilization, and the idea that it begins with the contamination or the ruination of children, because that's how you destroy the next generation of how we have set up our society, right?
Yeah.
And so as much as we love Dracula culturally as one of the tentpole monsters and as a character, there is, in some way, shape, or form, this kind of bizarre patriotism and bizarre xenophobia and jingoism that was instilled in the original writing from the perspective of someone who's like, oh, I'm quite safe here in Ireland, but what happens if a scary foreign man comes?
Yeah,
that's really what the book is. Yeah, it's ultimately
it's
about.
really, it is Eastern Europeans are coming here to steal our children, or coming here to sort of like taint our gene pool or our blood, or that's literally what the book is. And it's not a coincidence that it's Eastern European people that are doing it. So it's, a lot of weird shit is coded in a lot of this. And I feel like they were never going to be able to address that in 31. And I don't think they would have wanted to either. I don't think they would have cared at that point.
Sure. But yeah, I mean, but apart from the sort of the racist implications of it, Stephen King makes great use of this in Salem's Lot.
Yeah.
It's a
Well, he also uses, Stephen King also kind of comes back to that, the homosexuality aspect of it as well. Unfortunately, he does not execute it in any way that is respectful.
What?
But
Stephen
he does
King?
include it. Yeah, I know. Go figure. But he does sort of include a lot of this stuff about like sort of very well-heeled foreign men coming to the United States, and there's children involved. Like, there's a lot of weird shit like that involved too.
Yeah. But yeah, like I was also going to mention, like Murnau's version does it. It's a little bit more understated. But yes, Herzog's version in particular leans the fuck into that version of the story.
God, that movie is amazing.
It's so good, man. But yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of the last we're going to hear of the whole Bloofer lady thing. So yeah, moving on. Also, Lupita Torva is acting the fucking hell out of this scene. She is so good in this movie.
She is, and what she does, because I watched the right before this, I watched Browning's version, and I can't even remember that woman's name. She's such a sort of like a paper bag of a character. Like, you're just like, I don't give a shit what happens to her. But Lupita Tovar sells you on this sort of like petulant young woman who's a little bit defiant. Like, she makes dumb choices because she's young, and you get all of that in her performance. Whereas, you know, in Browning's version, you're just like, she's kind of a throwaway character, which is bizarre since she's like a central
like
character
the
in the story. But she's such a boring, bland character that when you see Lupita Tovar do it, she's just kind of, she lights up the screen. She's very pretty. She's very present. She feels very authentic in the way that she's selling you this kind of like impetuous youth.
Oh yeah, but
makes bad decisions.
This scene in particular, because this is where like Van Helsing shows or reads the story to her, and she's afraid, and she does afraid and scared in a way that like you really pick up on and feel. Like, this is one of the parts where I was like, ooh, okay, all right, I'm a little spooked by this. That's great.
Yeah.
But yeah. But this is also the scene where she breaks up with Juan because it's the will of Dracula who is working through her. So yeah, we move through all of this. Van Helsing then sets up some wolfsbane around Eva's room to defer El Conde. Dracula out in the garden is pissed. Yeah. So he goes to
does a lot of staring.
He's doing a lot. There's a lot of eye work happening.
Yeah. Oh, especially since they cut real close. Like the close-up shots of Viorius's eyes is like this movie's version of the Dracula eye band from the Lugosi version.
Which
There's
go ahead, Michael.
I was gonna say it's the Carlos Viorius school of eye acting, and we all got a lesson.
And I think that what might be where I started to kind of appreciate him a little bit more is that, because I think Lugosi has one speed, and it's this movie, and he does it in every other movie that he's ever in. And Viorius, you start to see that there is subtlety. It's just, you gotta get real close to see it. And when they do, you're like, okay, he's sort of giving me something. He's giving me menace. He's giving me anger. He's giving more than Lugosi ever does. They just fucking shine a light across his face, and you're like, oh, okay. I guess he's magic or upset, or I don't know. I don't really know, but I really liked that. I liked that the closer they get to him, the more he gives you with his face.
Yeah. So he goes to Renfield's window and he telepathically commands him, revealing his plan to Renfield, but not to us. So Van Helsing has Dracula's plan all figured out now. They need to find where Dracula is kicking it, drive a stake through his heart while he sleeps. But then Renfield busts in to distract them all while Dracula has his way with Eva. Because apparently Renfield just gets out, wanders around, constantly leaving his room.
Yeah, I was thinking about that while watching this. I'm just like, this is a very low security asylum.
That's real loosey-goosey, the way they're just letting people come and go.
Yeah.
And he leaves his room quite a bit. And I'd love also at some point, it might even be around here, where they're like, I'm going to put him in a room he can't escape from. Well, joke's on you, because
well, yeah, because he pries the bars apart, and it's like, well, he probably could have just gone out the door.
Yeah.
I know. Renfield tells a story about Dracula coming to his window and promising him eternal life by way of an endless supply of rats to feed from. It is metal as hell, what he describes, yeah.
Rats, a sea of rats.
Yeah. So Dracula then hypnotizes the nurse to let him into Eva's room and for her to remove the wolfsbane from her bed. And then he goes down to confront Van Helsing, telling him that he's made Eva a vampire. Van Helsing is stopped by Dracula's dominant stare as he reaches for something in his coat. But El Conde makes a stupid mistake when he commands Van Helsing to take out whatever he was going for and put it on the table because he was going for a cross in his pocket. So with the cross out, he drives Dracula out of the house.
And in the most spectacular way, he sort of flashes the cross in Dracula's face, and he does his big face thing. And then he just sort of goes prancing out the door, just prancing off into the night.
This particular Van Helsing performance is quite interesting. I don't know. It's just I think of Peter Cushing so frequently as the definitive Van Helsing for me, that this guy he does give like casual professor who just happens to be there. But every Van Helsing by and large tends to have some level of authority. He just seems to be like the cool teacher.
Hey, he shows up. He's like, "Hey guys, listen, trust me.
Yeah.
It's a vampire. I got this."
Yeah, he does. He walks in and he's just like, "Hey everybody."
Yeah,
vampires.
Most people, I know that it says Dr. Van Helsing on the board, but you can call me Abraham.
Yeah,
Like,
Dr. Van Helsing is my dad.
So upstairs, Eva comes out of her room, looking as alive as ever, but totally a vampire now.
And man, look, I try not to comment on people's bodies, but that dress is showing off her nips.
Yep.
Big time. Like, that would never clear a censor in the U.S.
No, even before the Hays Code.
Yeah.
So she reveals herself to Harker, a real idiot, and then he has all the anti-Dracula stuff removed. Out on the balcony, Floppy Bat Dracula shows up, demands that she have Harker remove all of the wards against him. And when he refuses, she attacks Harker, and Van Helsing arrives with a cross to drive her back, and she explains what happened to her, having drank the blood of Dracula. Later, as Eva arrests, Dracula summons the nurse again to let him into Eva's room. And we cut away as she screams. Now, elsewhere at the cemetery, Harker and Van Helsing do the terrible deed of staking Lucia and then head over to Carfax Abbey to deal with El Conde, who carries Eva down the steps to the crypt where Renfield waits.
I love the staking of Lucia off screen, which, you know, in film language is just so not something we would ever do. I mean, even then, that's, you know, it's a visual medium to have this big set piece where it's like, we killed a vampire who you've met, but we did it while you were elsewhere.
I know.
They're like, look, she gets a day rate and we can't afford it. She went home already.
So while you were in the lobby getting snow caps, we killed her, and you don't need to worry about it.
I know, because they basically we see this like long shot of the cemetery gates, and then they sort of like emerge dramatically from the fog and sort of like wipe their brows, and they're like, "Whew, boy, that was tough, huh? Well, on to the next thing."
It's like that joke, that Simpsons joke, where it was like when they come back and it's something about the vice president. It was like the president almost avoided death or something, where it's like basically the joke is that they don't fill you in on what happened. It would have been better if I remembered the actual joke, but you get what I mean.
Yep. Harker and Van Helsing call out to Eva. Also, I want to point out, like, what a fumble, you know, on a show where we routinely reference.
I know. I had it in my head like 2 minutes ago, and then I was like, I can't remember it now.
Harker and Van Helsing call out to Eva, alerting their presence to Dracula. Enraged, thinking that they followed Renfield, Dracula throws him from the steps to his death below.
Which is great because in the original that was how the original was supposed. I keep saying the original. It's not the original. The English language version. That's how it's supposed to end. Is that he tosses him off the stairs? But the censors were like, "Nope, you're not doing that. You're not throwing him off a giant set of stairs. Instead, he like clumsily thuds down the stairs in this very ostentatious way."
Yeah.
But this is how it's actually supposed to end, and it's much more effective because he kind of grabs him and chucks him off the giant staircase. Because I love that shot of the giant staircase.
It's a hell of a shot. Oh my God, what a set.
And then he, like, the way he turns back to Eva, who's laying kind of on the stairs, and they're shooting him from above. And he does that thing again where he sort of sets upon her and kind of scoops her up. It's a very dramatic moment, but it's way more effective.
Yeah. Then he gives Van Helsing the slip, escaping into the crypt. But before he could do anything, the sun rising drives him back to his coffin, leaving him vulnerable. Harker runs off to find Eva as Van Helsing stakes Dracula.
He makes a sound that sounds like he's either dying or doing something else.
Yeah. And then,
Perhaps both.
The little dying, you might say.
Reunited, Harker and Eva ascend the stairs back to the world of the living. We cut to the title card, fade to black.
Well, there it is.
Yeah.
Cinema.
Well, so Michael, usually we end this with sort of a revisiting of the major themes and thinking, how does this movie age? Since we know this movie has aged pretty well, I'm going to ask a different question. Because there is a bit of a controversy over which is better or which is worse, what do you think? Which one do you think is more successful?
Well, I saw a critical take from when the movie was recovered and sort of was having its moment in the sun decades later, where someone said, I would caution you to claim that this movie is better while considering the fact that it's just, the talk of the town at the moment. And, I'm paraphrasing what that person said. But basically, it's just like, is it better or is it just better right now? And having just watched it, of course, I have these very strong opinions of, I think this handled so much so well. Mm. And I think that, if anything, because it was so linked to Browning's version, that's the biggest disservice, because I don't even know that I want to think of them in the same breath. I think that, of course, there is going to be comparison just by virtue of era, of filming, of production, of circumstance. But it really shows in many ways. I think about that bizarre thing that happened when Rennie Harlin and Paul Schrader both made the same Exorcist movie because of a studio thing, and how vastly different those movies are. That's what's happening here. It shows what happens when one artist and one group of collaborators have the same access but go off in a totally different direction than somebody else. I like this movie for totally different reasons than the Browning version. And as a longtime fan of Dracula, I have a hard time even comparing movies at this point, because I've seen Dracula on screen so much that, yes, I have my favorites, but when you get in the weeds with other Dracula scholars or enthusiasts, what's better is almost inconsequential. I think that may be a long non-answer, but I love him as Dracula in this, while also thinking he's utterly ridiculous as Dracula in this. But I don't dislike that,
I think that is, for me, it was impossible to not compare them, especially because they are, almost literally the same movie. But I think that also emphasizes why I enjoy this one so much, because I've seen the Browning version a million times at this point, and you're watching what is effectively the same movie, but you have a group of people that are under-resourced, and yet they still deliver something that is uniquely theirs.
Yeah.
While working within these constraints of, essentially having to produce the same film for a different audience. And yet they still come out with something that is unique to them. And I think that's what makes it such an interesting movie. I think, they both, this succeeds in a lot of places that the other one does not, and vice versa. I think they're more or less, you know.
What I will say in favor of this movie is that Browning's version of all of the Universal monster movies, I do think, is the slowest. It is. Yeah. It is, in many ways, a very glacially paced film. And what's interesting is, even though it is shorter than this version, I think this version moves much more, yes. And it has a much more clipped pace. And it's fascinating that this film didn't have the resources and it didn't have the time or the backing that its daytime counterpart did, but it somehow is a half hour longer, not to its detriment, but to its betterment. This is one of those rare occasions where more is more and it works. And I think that it was allowed to breathe in ways Browning's was not. And by not being able to breathe, Browning's actually feels slower, which is a very bizarre thing.
And I think that also you get away from the fact that it's a horror movie. And I think they don't do that in the Spanish language version. Is there are constant reminders that this is a horror film. Like, yes, it is a big, sweeping, gothic thing. And I think Browning's version leans into that more. This sort of big, you know, like and that was, I think, kind of a popular style at the time and for the next decade or so, you know, in the studios. This one, they leave in the moments or emphasize the horror a little bit more to remind you that this is not a safe movie, even though it does feel this like a sort of a bigger melodrama.
I think that the This Is the Better version was sort of the result of film hipsters in 1992 sort of discovering a film that was lost and sort of experiencing something that, like you said, it's functionally it is an identical movie to Tod Browning's version. But
I mean, that's the thing, is they're being asked to make the same movie. It's inevitable that they're going to be compared. You can't not do it.
Right. But yeah, I think that this one does certain things better than the other one. The other one does things better than this one. We have outstanding performances. Lupita Tovar is extraordinarily captivating. She's so good. Like we mentioned before, the dynamism in terms of just the photography in the film, the fact the camera moves a lot more. It's a very kinetic movie. You know, it doesn't feel as confined and static. Like it's in that respect, I do think that it is a better movie to watch. Michael, like you mentioned, the fact that it's longer is not a problem whatsoever. It was one of the things that we were talking about before we did this was it does not feel longer. It has great pacing throughout it. It's just, practically speaking, it's it's great. If you've not seen this version of the movie, I beg you, seek it out. Like, you've probably got Dracula on Blu-ray or DVD, you know, and therefore you probably have access to this movie. Like, you absolutely should watch this movie. It is distinct enough, it is different enough to feel like a different movie.
And I advocate that everyone go out and buy the Universal Monsters collection.
Absolutely.
I realize it's a bit of an investment. It is one of the best monies I've ever spent. I get a lot of enjoyment out of that giant collection. You get, like, if you buy the big one, you get all of them, and it's fucking great.
Yeah. So, all right, Michael, thank you so much for joining us on this auspicious of occasions. There's nobody else that I would rather talk about Dracula with.
Well, thank you. I had a great time, and I was very excited to experience a Dracula movie I hadn't seen. So I appreciate you inviting me for this one particularly.
Yeah. What's going on? What do you got to plug?
Oh, you got a new movie, I believe.
Yes, I'm currently rolling out a feature film that I wrote and directed called There's a Zombie Outside, which is a queer horror extravaganza of sorts. I also just wrote and directed the Fangoria Chainsaw Awards. This is my third year in being involved with the Chainsaw Awards.
Oh, that's
third
great.
year writing, second year directing. And those are airing on Shudder October 13th, depending when this comes out. It may already be out. So that's what's been going on. And obviously, if you love cult cinema, every other Wednesday at midnight, you can hear me and Peaches Christ talk about the movies that folks worship at the altar of.
Oh yeah, we had Peaches on for Fright Night. We had to complete the collection by having you.
That's right.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
All right, Dave, what's next?
Well, 99 Cent Rental will be back next week We're talking about the bonkers Toho, maybe horror film, House. I guess horror film. Someone gets eaten by a piano. That's scary. And Bring Me the Axe will be back in 2 weeks with a listener request. We are doing 1994's Cemetery Man, starring a very fetching Rupert Everett.
Ooh, he's a handsome man.
He is a handsome man in that film and in many other films.
Yep. So yeah, be back here in a week as we take on House. And be back in 2 for Cemetery Man. We go Italian.
Yep.